My family owns a small vacation cabin tucked away in Colorado's snowy mountains. It's an old place, built decades before I was even born, and while it has its charm, it's showing its age. My dad has spent years maintaining it, patching up the roof, fixing creaky floorboards, and debating whether to knock it down and build something new. But to me, it's always been a place of childhood wonder, where my brother and I spent countless winters playing in the vast, snow-covered landscape that surrounded it. This story, however, happened about 15 years ago when I was 7 and my older brother, Max, was 10. It was during a fierce snowstorm. The kind of blizzard where the wind howls through the trees and the snow piles up so quickly it feels like the whole world is blanketed in white. Despite the harsh weather, Max and I couldn't resist heading outside to play. Our cabin sits on a sprawling property surrounded by dense woods, with a long, narrow road that dead ends at the base of a hill. Beyond the road are a few other homes, equally remote and largely unoccupied during the winter. The setting was perfect for the kinds of games we loved: snowball fights, hide and seek, and our favorite, fort raids. The rules of the game were simple. Each of us would build a snow fort in separate locations, complete with walls and hiding spots, and conceal a large snowball inside, the jewel. The goal was to sneak into the other's fort, steal the jewel, and bring it back to your own base without getting caught. That day, Max chose to set up his fort on the neighboring property down the hill. The house there was rarely occupied, and we often used the empty yard as our playground, knowing the owners wouldn't mind. Once Max had picked his spot, he grabbed his gear and disappeared down the road, promising to blow a whistle when he was ready for the game to begin. I waited by my fort, building up my defenses and keeping an eye on the woods around me. Minutes passed, and the whistle never came. At first, I figured Max was just taking his time, but as the wait stretched to 10 minutes, I started to grow restless. Maybe I hadn't heard the whistle over the howling wind? Deciding I'd waited long enough, I debated my next move. The woods seemed like the faster route, but trudging through snow-laden trees during a blizzard wasn't appealing, especially for a 7-year-old. I chose to follow the road instead, hoping to avoid the eerie silence of the forest. The snow crunched loudly beneath my boots as I made my way downhill. The wind stung my face, but my thick layers kept me warm. When I reached the edge of the neighboring property, I paused. Through the bare, winter-stripped trees, I could just make out Max's fort, a lopsided pile of snow near the driveway. But Max was nowhere to be seen. I crouched low, stepping quietly through the woods to get a better look, half expecting him to jump out and ambush me. Instead, the yard was eerily still. His footprints were there, leading toward the fort, but no sign of him. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning the area. The fort was hastily built, as if he'd thrown it together in a rush. I circled it, searching for any sign of him, but it was empty. Just as I reached out to claim the jewel, a voice called out from behind me. "Excuse me, are you looking for your brother?" Startled, I turned toward the sound. Standing on the front porch of the neighboring house was a woman. She looked older, her gray hair tied back under a thick scarf, and she wore a long, heavy coat. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, given the situation. I hesitated, unsure whether to respond. "We're just playing a game," I said finally, my voice barely audible over the wind. She smiled, but there was something off about it, a stiffness that sent a chill down my spine. "Your brother isn't here," she said, gesturing toward the house. "Why don't you come inside and warm up?" Her words didn't sit right with me. Why would Max be in the house? He had no reason to go inside, and he certainly wouldn't have left without telling me. As I stood there, unsure of what to do, I noticed movement in one of the upstairs windows. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was Max. Someone was peering out, their face partially obscured by a dark hat or beanie, with only their eyes visible above the windowsill. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't him. I looked back at the woman, who was still smiling that unnerving smile. Something about her felt wrong. Her posture, her tone, the way she seemed completely unbothered by the blizzard raging around us, it all set off alarm bells in my head. I glanced down at the snow and noticed another set of footprints leading to the house. They were small, about Max's size, and they stopped at the front door. But what struck me was that the tracks doubled back, as if Max had started to approach the house, then turned and fled toward the woods. "Josh!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. The woman's smile faltered. She hadn't expected me to yell. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, from inside the house, I heard heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending the stairs. My instinct screamed at me to run. The woman called out, something sharp and urgent, but I didn't stay to listen. I turned and bolted, my boots slipping on the icy ground as I sprinted back toward the road. Behind me, I heard the front door creak open and more footsteps, faster this time, crunching through the snow. I didn't dare look back. The cold air burned my lungs as I pushed myself harder, following the trail I'd left earlier. When I finally reached the road, I spotted two figures coming toward me through the swirling snow. My dad and Mac's relief washed over me as I stumbled into their arms, gasping out an incoherent explanation of what had happened. Max, equally shaken, recounted a similar experience. He had approached the house to grab a better vantage point for the game, but was stopped by the same woman, who tried to lure him inside. Sensing danger, he turned and ran back toward the woods, eventually making his way home. Hearing this, my dad's expression darkened. He grabbed a flashlight and a metal bat from the cabin and told us to stay inside with our mom. We watched anxiously from the window as he disappeared into the storm. He returned half an hour later, pale and visibly shaken. The house had been locked, with no sign of the woman or the person I'd seen in the window. The police were called, and after contacting the homeowners, it was confirmed that the house was supposed to be vacant. Officers searched the property but found nothing. To this day, the memory of that encounter lingers, a chilling reminder of how quickly a harmless game can turn into something far more sinister. We never played on that property again, and every time I think about the woman's smile, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd stepped inside. The heavy footsteps grew louder, thundering down the stairs inside the house, and without waiting to see who or what was coming, I bolted. The woman's voice rang out behind me, shouting something, whether at me or someone else, I couldn't tell. Her words were muffled by the wind and snow, and I didn't stop to try to make sense of them. As I sprinted away, I glanced back once, and my stomach dropped. The face I had seen earlier in the upstairs window was gone. The empty window loomed above the house like a gaping void, and the dread in my chest only grew heavier. I ran harder, following the path I had made in the snow when I first arrived, the cold air burning my lungs with each desperate breath. The sound of my dad's whistle cut through the wind like a beacon. It was the sharp, familiar tune he always used to call us home when it was time for dinner. Relief and panic collided as I realized how close I was to safety, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins wouldn't let me slow down. When I finally reached our driveway, I saw my dad and Josh standing there, bundled up and waiting for me. My dad's face was tense, his eyes scanning the road behind me, while Josh looked pale and shaken. They had been coming to find me. Before I could even get a word out, Josh began explaining, his voice unsteady. He said there were people in the neighboring house who had tried to get him to come inside. My heart sank as I interrupted him to say the same thing had just happened to me. My dad's jaw tightened, and without wasting a second, he turned and marched back inside the cabin, emerging moments later with a flashlight and what looked like a tire iron. He told us to stay in the house with our mom and locked the door behind him as he headed toward the neighbor's property. The minutes dragged on as we waited anxiously by the window, watching the snow fall heavier and the sky grow darker. My mom kept reassuring us that everything would be fine, but I could see the worry in her eyes. It felt like an eternity before my dad returned, his face pale and his expression grim. He told us that the front door of the house was locked, and no one had answered when he knocked. He hadn't been able to find any sign of the woman or anyone else, though he admitted he hadn't ventured too far into the property. Instead, he had gone to another neighbor's house to ask if they knew anything about the people staying there. What he learned made my skin crawl. The neighbors had contacted the owners of the house, who confirmed that the property was supposed to be vacant. No one had been staying there, and no one should have been there that weekend. The news left my dad visibly rattled, though he tried to downplay it for our sake. The police were called, and when they arrived, Josh and I had to recount everything we had seen. We described the woman and the person in the window. Though our details were limited, it was hard to recall much in the middle of such a surreal and frightening experience. The officers searched the property and found that the back door had been unlocked, but the house was empty. Nothing appeared to have been stolen or disturbed. After that night, my parents became more cautious about leaving valuables at the cabin when we weren't there. They packed up anything important, just in case the incident was part of a break-in attempt. But for Josh and me, the event left a deeper mark. We stopped playing on the neighboring property altogether, haunted by the memory of the woman's eerie smile and the unanswered question of what might have happened if we had stepped inside. Even now, I can't help but feel grateful that we trusted our instincts and ran when we did. That memory stuck with me as I grew up, a reminder of how quickly a seemingly harmless situation can turn dark. It's strange to think how much of our childhood was shaped by that cabin, by the snowy winters and endless adventures we had in the woods. But that day changed something. It made us realize that not everything in those woods, or the homes scattered within them, is as innocent as it seems. Whatever was happening in that house remains a mystery, and maybe it's better that way. Some things, I've learned, are best left unanswered. As we stood atop the slope, still joking about the fireball shooters, we playfully claimed they gave us super ski powers. The girls found our antics amusing, but Devin smirked and pulled out an unmarked bottle of her own, teasing us for sticking to something as mild as fireball. Feeling challenged, all four of us jumped at the chance to prove ourselves and eagerly took a few swigs. I immediately noticed Ryland getting a little too enthusiastic with the drink. He had a tendency to overdo it, and tonight was no exception. Taking note of his behavior and the surreal vibe of the whole situation, I decided to pace myself. Something about the sudden appearance of these girls and their unrelenting charm gnawed at the back of my mind. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the entire interaction felt just a bit too perfect to be genuine. Still, Amir was thriving. His natural flirtatiousness was on full display, and Taylor seemed to be eating it up, giggling at his every joke. I figured we'd probably spend the rest of our evening skiing with these girls, which I didn't mind. Who knew, maybe they'd even suggest something fun to do once the slopes closed. But then Devin threw us a curveball, casually asking if we'd ever tried a trail called Devil's Forest. None of us recognized the name, though Chase, our usual trail expert, would have known it in an instant. Unfortunately, he wasn't with us on this trip, so we were left relying on Devin's vague description. According to her, it was a lesser-known glade trail, narrow, tree-lined paths perfect for weaving through the forest. That alone piqued our interest. Glade trails were our favorite, and the idea of discovering an obscure one felt like a small adventure. Curiosity outweighed caution as we all agreed to give it a try. Devin and Taylor grinned and gestured for us to follow. The fresh snow was untouched as we skied along, and soon we found ourselves at a choke point where the girls instructed us to unclip our skis. Apparently, we have to hike a short distance uphill to reach the trailhead. This was odd. Normally, ski trails were accessible directly from the lifts, but none of us voiced any concerns. The snow was crisp beneath our boots as we trudged behind the girls, their laughter echoing through the silent forest. Amir and Ryland, predictably, stuck close to Devin and Taylor, flirting as they climbed. Jaden and I hung back slightly, watching the scene unfold with a mix of amusement and unease. "What do you think?" I whispered to Jaden, catching the furrow in his brow. "I don't like it," he admitted. "Have you ever had to walk uphill to find a trail? This doesn't make sense." I nodded, my own uneasiness beginning to solidify. Jaden and I had always been the more cautious ones in the group, and this moment was no exception. Still, I shrugged it off, telling myself that there wasn't much these two girls could do to a group of four guys. That thought gave me enough comfort to press on. Eventually, the slope leveled out, and we caught up with the others. Amir and Ryland were practically tripping over themselves to impress the girls, with Ryland now casually draping an arm around Devin's shoulder. She didn't seem to mind. In fact, she looked entirely pleased with herself. They led us a little further into the forest before stopping and pointing downhill. The slope they indicated was narrow and steep, flanked by dense trees on either side. "There it is," Devin said, gesturing toward the snow-covered trail. Something about it seemed off. The fresh snow was completely undisturbed, as if no one had used the path in years. "Are you sure this leads back to the lifts?" Jaden asked, his tone sharp with skepticism. "Absolutely," Taylor said, her tone sweet but firm. "It connects at the bottom. Don't worry, we've done it plenty of times." Before I could protest, Devin pulled out her bottle again, her mischievous grin returning. One last drink before we go, she insisted. Amir and Ryland eagerly grabbed the bottle, taking generous gulps as if it were a badge of honor. When it reached Jaden, he shook his head and said, "I've had enough." I saw it then, a flicker of irritation crossing Devon's face. It was subtle, just the briefest shadow of annoyance, but it vanished so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined it. She quickly replaced the look with a dazzling smile, leaning in close to Jaden and coaxing him with soft words. He sighed, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to cause a scene, and finally took a reluctant sip. By the time the bottle made its way to me, I held it to my lips but didn't drink. My instincts were screaming now, though I still couldn't pinpoint why. I handed the bottle back without a word, noting that neither Devon nor Taylor took a sip this time. The realization hit me like a slap. These girls hadn't been drinking all night, not once. My pulse quickened as I glanced around at my friends, who were blissfully unaware of the growing tension. Whatever was happening here, it didn't feel right. And yet, we followed them anyway. It finally struck me that neither Devon nor Taylor had taken even a single sip from their bottle the entire time. That realization made my stomach churn. I glanced at my phone. Only 30 minutes remained until the lifts closed. I scrambled for an excuse to back out, mumbling that we might not have enough time to ski this trail and still make it back to where we'd parked. Devon dismissed my concerns with a breezy smile, assuring us that the trail connected to the base lifts. Taylor chimed in, telling us we'd be fine if we just stopped wasting time. Then, without warning, they took off down the slope, their laughter echoing through the trees as they challenged us to follow. Amir and Ryland took the bait, eagerly chasing after them with no hesitation, clearly hoping to keep the fun alive. Jaden and I hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Neither of us wanted to go, but we both knew leaving the group wasn't an option. Reluctantly, we followed, with Jaden leading the way. The slope was steep and narrow, bordered by dense trees, and I could feel my nerves heighten with every turn. Skiing through a forest is no small task, even under normal circumstances, and the added tension didn't help. When we reached the bottom, I felt a momentary wave of relief seeing Amir, Ryland, and the girls already there, laughing as if everything was normal. But as Jaden and I caught up, that relief was short-lived. Something was wrong. There was no lift in sight. We were surrounded by nothing but forest. My chest tightened as I turned to the girls and demanded an explanation. Taylor brushed it off with a laugh, saying the lift was just nearby and we should relax. Devon added that she'd show us the way in a minute. Their casual demeanor made me second-guess my instincts, and I started to convince myself that maybe I'd overreacted. That fragile sense of calm shattered when I heard a thud in the snow. I turned to see Ryland collapsed on his back, motionless. My heart leapt into my throat as Devon chuckled, calling him a lightweight. But something about her tone felt wrong. It wasn't concern, just amusement. Before I could process what was happening, Amir slumped over too, landing face first in the snow. Panic surged through me as I unclipped my skis and rushed to their sides. Thankfully, both were breathing, but they were completely unresponsive. My mind raced, desperate for answers. What the hell was going on? Jaden stepped forward, his voice shaking as he demanded, "What did you do to them?" Devon and Taylor exchanged glances, their expressions carefully neutral. "We didn't do anything," Taylor said, feigning innocence. But as Jaden took another step toward them, he suddenly crumpled to the ground. My breath caught as I stared at his unmoving form, my pulse pounding in my ears. This couldn't be happening. The girls stopped pretending at that point. Their cheerful facade melted away, replaced by something colder, more calculating. They stared at me with a look that sent chills down my spine, as if they were waiting for me to drop next. My vision blurred, and I felt my knees buckle. My head spun, and it was like the ground beneath me wasn't steady anymore. I couldn't let myself pass out. I forced myself to sit, gripping the snow for stability. "What did you give us?" I croaked, my voice hoarse with fear. Neither of them answered. They didn't even blink. I shouted the question again, louder this time, but they remained silent, watching me with unsettling calm. My strength was fading fast, but I clung to consciousness, refusing to give in. Eventually, Taylor muttered something to Devon, her tone irritated. "I caught only fragments, didn't drink enough," she said. Devon scowled, clearly frustrated. "We've wasted enough time," she snapped, her voice colder than the wind around us. They turned their attention to Amir and Ryland's gear, unclipping their skis and hefting them over their shoulders. I wanted to stop them, but my body felt like lead. I could only watch as they trudged off into the forest, carrying my friend's equipment with them. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but my limbs refused to cooperate. It was agonizing. After what felt like an eternity, I began to regain control. The numbness in my body subsided, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. I stumbled to my feet, shakily following the girls' tracks in the snow. Despite the weight of the skis they were carrying, they had moved fast, almost unnaturally so. Their footprints stretched far ahead of me, winding through the trees like a trail of breadcrumbs. My breathing was ragged, my legs burning as I pushed forward, determined to catch up. Finally, I turned a corner and saw them in the distance, their figures silhouetted against a clearing. The sight before me made my blood run cold. The forest opened up into a road, and parked at the edge of the clearing was a dark van. Its side door slid open, and 4 men climbed out, their burly frames and grim expressions making my stomach twist. The girls handed over the skis without a word, motioning for the men to get back inside. One of the men turned, his gaze locking onto me. My heart stopped. He raised a hand, pointing directly at me, and I felt every hair on my body stand on end. I didn't wait to see what they'd do. I spun on my heel and bolted back the way I'd come, my boots crunching loudly in the snow. Panic gripped me as I ran, the trees blurring past in a haze of white and black. I didn't dare look back, convinced that at any moment I'd hear footsteps closing in. The only thought in my mind was getting back to my friends. I needed to wake them, get us out of there, and put as much distance as possible between us and whatever this was. When I finally reached the slope where I'd left them, I was gasping for air, my chest heaving with exertion. Amir and Ryland were still unconscious, their faces pale but peaceful. I knelt beside Jaden, shaking him desperately. After a few tense moments, his eyelids fluttered, and he groaned softly. Relief washed over me as I helped him sit up, explaining what had happened in hurried, panicked whispers. Together, we worked to rouse the others, but it took nearly an hour before they were fully conscious. By then, the van and the girls were long gone. We were left alone in the silent forest, surrounded by nothing but shadows and questions. What had they wanted? Why had they targeted us? And what could have happened if I'd passed out too? These thoughts haunted me as we made our way back to the main trail, leaving the cursed slope behind. Whatever their intentions, one thing was clear: we had come terrifyingly close to something far worse than just losing our skis. When I finally retraced my steps to where I'd left my friends, they were still unconscious, sprawled out in the snow as if they hadn't moved an inch. My heart was pounding, my breath clouding in the cold air as I dropped to my knees beside Jaden. He seemed like the most likely to wake up first, so I grabbed a handful of snow and pressed it gently against his face, calling his name. After a few tense moments, his eyelids fluttered open, and he let out a groggy groan. Relief surged through me as he sat up, disoriented but alive. I hurriedly explained what had happened, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. Jaden's eyes widened as he listened, and we both turned our attention to Amir and Ryland, who were still out cold. We tried everything to wake them, more snow, shaking them, even shouting, but nothing worked. Jaden and I exchanged anxious glances, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. We had no choice but to wait and pray that those people, whoever they were, didn't decide to come back. The minutes crawled by, each one filled with a suffocating tension as we kept glancing over our shoulders, half expecting to see the dark figures emerging from the trees. My mind raced with questions. Who were those girls? What had they given us? And most importantly, why? The possibilities were chilling, and my stomach twisted at the thought of how close we'd come to losing more than just our skis. After what felt like an eternity, nearly an hour by my watch, Amir and Ryland finally began to stir. They were sluggish, their movements heavy and uncoordinated, but they were awake. Jaden and I quickly filled them in on everything that had happened while they were out, our voices low but urgent. The more we talked, the more horrified they looked, the gravity of the situation sinking in. None of it made sense. Why target a group of broke college students? Sure, Ryland and Amir had expensive skis, but was that really enough to justify such an elaborate setup? The whole thing felt like overkill, as if there had been some other, darker motive at play. Finding our way back to the car was a nightmare. The snow had erased much of our trail, and the dense forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. We stuck close together, using what little light we had left to navigate through the trees. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the snow and the occasional snap of a branch. Every shadow felt like a threat, every rustle a reminder of the danger we'd narrowly escaped. By the time we finally reached the parking lot, we were all too exhausted to speak. We climbed into the truck and drove off without a second glance, leaving that cursed slope far behind. Reporting the incident to the police was its own ordeal. The officers listened to our story with a mix of skepticism and concern, jotting down notes as we described the girls, the van, and everything that had transpired. They promised to investigate, but it was clear they didn't have much to go on. The people running the mountain resort were more sympathetic, assuring us that they'd review security footage and do their best to identify the culprits. But deep down, I knew we wouldn't get any answers. These weren't amateurs. Whoever they were, they'd planned this carefully, leaving no trail for anyone to follow. The drive home was silent, the weight of what we'd just experienced hanging heavy in the air. None of us knew what to say. We were alive, and for that, I was grateful. But the questions lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. What if I hadn't pretended to drink? What if we hadn't escaped? The scenarios played out in my head, each one more terrifying than the last. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that we were lucky, too lucky. Whatever those people had planned for us, it wasn't just a simple robbery. It couldn't have been. To this day, we have no idea what substance they gave us. Nothing we found online matches the effects we experienced, especially in such a small dose. Our best guess is that it was some kind of mix, designed to incapacitate us quickly without raising suspicion. It's a chilling thought, one that makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. Those girls, and whoever else was involved, were more than just thieves. They were calculated, methodical, and undeniably sinister. Looking back, I can't help but feel a sense of gratitude that things didn't end worse than they did. But that gratitude is overshadowed by a lingering unease, a constant reminder of how close we came to disaster. We never returned to that mountain, and I doubt we ever will. Some places are better left unexplored, and some experiences are better left as warnings. What happened to us that night was a lesson, a stark, terrifying lesson in trusting your instincts and staying vigilant, even when everything seems fine. Because sometimes, the most innocent-looking situations can hide the darkest intentions. The thin line of trees around the lake wasn't much of a forest, just a sparse scattering of trunks and branches, but it was enough to block any vehicle from driving through. We parked in a nearby lot and stepped out of the car, immediately hit by the icy grip of the night air. Bundled up in thick layers, we started the short trek toward the lake. Ricky and Kyle lit their cigarettes as we walked, the faint glow of the embers the only light aside from the moon and stars. I didn't smoke, and I still don't, but I've always found something oddly calming about the rhythmic puffs of smoke curling into the night. It must have been after midnight, though I couldn't say for sure. What I do remember is how eerily still it was, no animals, no distant cars, not even the rustle of a breeze. It was just us, the crunch of snow beneath our boots, and the quiet expanse of the frozen lake waiting ahead. When we reached the shoreline, the lake surface stretched out before us, a vast sheet of ice glowing faintly under the pale light of the moon. As expected, it seemed solid, undisturbed by the recent snowfall. Laughing over some stupid joke Kyle had made, we watched as he picked up a small rock, well, more of a chunk of ice, and hurled it onto the frozen surface. The rock skidded and spun, failing to crack the ice. Taking that as our green light, we ventured onto the lake, stepping carefully at first before gaining confidence with each step. We didn't wander too far, maybe 100 feet or so from the edge, far enough to feel surrounded by the icy wilderness, but not so far that we couldn't make a quick retreat if the ice betrayed us. We were still joking around, the sound of our laughter cutting through the night, when something in the distance caught our attention. At the far edge of the lake, near the tree line, a dark shape moved slowly across the snow. The three of us froze mid-conversation, our voices falling silent as we squinted at the figure. It was large and hunched, its movements deliberate and slow. At first, I thought it was a bear, and apparently, Ricky did too because he whispered, "Is that a bear?" as quietly as he could, his voice barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. I didn't respond, my heart was already hammering too loudly in my chest. If it was a bear, the last thing we wanted was to draw its attention. But as the figure shuffled closer, something about it felt wrong. The way it moved was too stiff, too upright. And then there was the object it was dragging behind it, a dark lump trailing over the snow like a weight tied to a rope. I couldn't make sense of it, and the more I watched, the more unsettling it became. My mind scrambled to rationalize what I was seeing, but nothing fit. When the figure finally straightened up completely, the truth hit us all at once. It wasn't a bear, it was a man, a person wearing what looked like a bear suit. "What the hell?" Kyle muttered under his breath, voicing what we were all thinking. My mouth opened to reply, but no words came out. Fear, confusion, and disbelief swirled in my head, freezing me in place. The man, or whatever he was, continued his slow march toward the ice, dragging that strange object behind him. The closer he got, the clearer the details became. The bag, if that's what it was, looked small and black, like a garbage bag, though it seemed too compact to contain anything ordinary. The whole scene felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. My instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but my body refused to move. Ricky and Kyle seemed equally paralyzed, their gazes locked on the man as he reached the edge of the lake. He knelt down, holding what looked like a heavy rock, and began slamming it into the ice with a deliberate, almost mechanical rhythm. Even from where we stood, I swear I could feel the faint vibration of each impact, the sound echoing across the frozen expanse. The realization hit me like a cold wave, he was trying to break through the ice. My stomach twisted as my mind raced to figure out why. Was he dumping something? Hiding evidence? The implications were horrifying. Ricky tapped me on the shoulder, snapping me out of my thoughts. I turned to see him and Kyle already retreating towards solid ground, their movements slow and cautious as if any noise might shatter the fragile barrier between us and the man. Without a word, I followed, every step feeling like a gamble. The snow crunched beneath our boots, impossibly loud in the suffocating silence, but we had no choice but to keep moving. We had barely made it a few yards when a voice rang out behind us, sharp and unmistakable, "Hey!" I didn't look back. I didn't think. I just ran. My legs pumped furiously, each step a desperate push through the snow as my breath came in ragged gasps. The cold air burned my lungs, and my chest felt like it might explode, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even process what I was running from, only that I had to get away. My vision blurred as adrenaline coursed through my veins, and the sound of my heartbeat drowned out everything else. I don't know if he followed us. I don't think he did. But in that moment, nothing else mattered except putting as much distance as possible between us and that man, or whatever he was. By the time we reached the edge of the lake, I was doubled over, gasping for air, my legs trembling from the exertion. Ricky and Kyle looked equally shaken, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. None of us said a word as we stumbled back to the car, too rattled to even glance over our shoulders. It wasn't until we were safely inside, doors locked and engine running, that the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, replaying the events over and over in our minds. The questions lingered, unanswered and unrelenting. Who was that man? What was in the bag? And why had he been out there in the dead of night, smashing ice on a frozen lake? Even now, I don't have the answers. But one thing is certain, I'll never look at that lake, or winter nights, the same way again. As we reached the edge of the lake, my lungs burned from the cold air, each breath coming in harsh gasps. We paused for only a moment before heading straight for the car, our legs trembling with the effort of running through the snow and adrenaline coursing through our veins. The silence between us was suffocating, each of us too rattled to speak as Kyle turned the key in the ignition and drove off without hesitation. The headlights cut through the snowy darkness, illuminating the winding road ahead, but none of us looked back. The car was our sanctuary now, its locked doors a flimsy but welcome barrier from whatever, or whoever, was out there. It wasn't until we were a few miles away that Kyle finally broke the silence. "Maybe it was just someone dumping trash," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I immediately shook my head, the absurdity of the idea snapping me out of my daze. In a bear suit? In the middle of the night? During a snowstorm? Who does that? I countered, the frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. Ricky chimed in, his voice low and uneasy. What if it wasn't trash? What if it was a body? The suggestion sent a chill down my spine, but I quickly dismissed it. That bag was way too small for a body, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they didn't bring me much comfort. For the rest of the drive, we tossed theories back and forth, each one more unsettling than the last. Was it some kind of ritual? A prank? An elaborate cover for something more sinister? None of it made sense. Every time we thought we were close to an explanation, the details refused to fit together. Why the bear suit? Why the bag? And why there, on that lake, in the dead of night? By the time we pulled into my driveway, the questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered and maddening. Days later, as the fear began to fade and the memory of that night settled into the realm of surreal, something happened that reignited the unease. My mom was watching TV in the living room, her usual true crime program playing softly in the background. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard the words missing child and froze. I glanced at the screen and saw the face of a young boy, his picture accompanied by the details of his disappearance. He had gone missing from a nearby town around the same time we had our strange encounter on the lake. My stomach twisted as the pieces clicked together in my mind. The timeline, the location, it all matched up too closely to ignore. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that what we had witnessed that night was somehow connected. Could the bag the man was dragging have held something that belonged to the boy? A piece of clothing, a toy, or something worse? My rational mind told me it was probably just a coincidence, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I shared my thoughts with Kyle and Ricky, and though they were skeptical, they agreed it was worth reporting. We contacted the local authorities, explaining what we had seen in as much detail as we could remember. The officer we spoke to seemed polite but noncommittal, jotting down notes and assuring us they would look into it. Whether they actually did or not, I'll never know. All I know is that nothing ever came of it, no follow-up, no headlines, no answers. To this day, the memory of that night lingers, as vivid and haunting as the moment it happened. I've replayed it in my mind countless times, dissecting every detail, every decision, every possibility. What was in that bag? Who was that man? And what would have happened if we hadn't run when we did? The uncertainty is its own kind of terror, a reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Even now, years later, I can't look at a frozen lake without feeling a knot of unease in my chest. The serene beauty I once loved now feels like a facade, hiding something darker beneath its surface. And every time I see a missing persons poster or hear about a cold case on the news, I think back to that snowy night, to the man in the bear suit, and wonder if we glimpsed a truth far more disturbing than we'll ever truly understand.